story from God's own country, which is to say, obviously, Wales. And it's about a village, a very small village in the valleys, and a house in the village, and in the house there is a mother and her son. And her son, Morgan, I'm afraid, is the fool of the village. Which is to say, if you're going to find anybody with a shrimp net at the village pond trying to fish out the reflection of the moon, it's going to be Morgan. If you find anyone trying to cut their own shadow from their feet, it's going to be Morgan. And every time he does something foolish, people say to him, there is nothing between your ears, Morgan. Morgan, you need a pot of brains to fill that gap. Until eventually Morgan decides the one thing he has got to do is get a pot of brains. And so he tells his mother that he's desperate to get a pot of brains, but where do you get a pot of brains from? And his mother says, there is the old woman. Some people call her a sorceress, some people call her a witch. And you could go to her. She lives out of the valley, over the hill, into the forest, and you'll find her in a cottage. And her son Morgan said, out of the village? He'd never been out of the village, but he was so desperate for a pot of brains that he said that he would go and find the old woman who lived out of the valley, over the hill, and into the forest. And as a temptation for her son to do this great task, his mother promised to create a veritable feast when he got home. A feast of offal. Morgan's favourite dish. So a feast of offal would include what? Kidneys? Brain, possibly? Liver? Oxtail could be. All of those things. Actually, it was going to be mutton. But we're going to have kidneys with the core out, obviously, because that's not a pleasant thing to eat, the core. Liver that's not been cooked so that it will sole a shoe. And the best thing of all, of course, stuffed lamb's hearts, which are absolutely delicious. So with that tempting thought, Morgan went off to find the old woman who lived out of the valley, over the hill, and into the forest. And he stepped to the edge of the village and reached the border of the village, and he'd never gone beyond that border, and he looked around him, and there in the window, watching him, was the one person who had never said to him, Morgan, between your ears there is nothing. You would need a pot of brains to fill that gap. It was Gwyneth Powell, just waving at him. And he looked at her and he said, I'm going to get a pot of brains. Putting off the moment of leaving the village, and she leaned out the window and said, Morgan, you're fine the way you are. But he was determined, so off he went. And he stepped over the boundary of the village, and then he went out of the valley, up the hill, down the hill, and into the forest, and he found the cottage. And he knocked on the door. And the door was opened as if by an unseen hand, which had absolutely nothing to do with the length of twine that was tied to the knob on the other side, and reached out to the old woman's hand as she sat in her rocking chair waiting for someone to come. And he went in to the cottage and he looked at the old woman and he said, I want a pot of brains. And she looked at him and she said, a pot of brains you ask of me, but could you use it? We shall see. Because the old people all speak in rhyme. It's one of those things. She said, bring me the heart you love the best, and then brains you will have if you pass my test. And then she cackled, which apparently is also what old people do. And Morgan, slightly disturbed by this, stepped backwards and stepped across the threshold out of the cottage, and the door closed as if moved by an unseen hand, which had nothing to do with the broom handle the old lady had next to her in the rocking chair. Morgan went back to his house. He'd gone back through the forest, over the hill, back down to the valley, to his cottage, and on his way, of course, he'd passed Gwyneth, who'd looked at him expectantly. Well, And he just went. He arrived back home and there was the most delicious smell. The smell of onions, the smell of roasting meat, the smell of rosemary. And he sat with his mother and he ate. And he just didn't know what to do because the old woman had said that he must take her the heart he loved best. And as his mother listened to his story, she said, come on, eat your food. You've left that bit on the side. And he said, no, I'm saving that till last. It's the best bit. That's the lamb's hearts. They're the best. So he took out his hanky that was clean, fortunately. He put the lamb's heart in the hanky. He finished his supper. And then he went to bed with the lamb's heart under his pillow. The next morning, of course, the lamb's heart was a little bit squashed, but he got up and he had his breakfast, 2 beautifully fried eggs prepared by his mother, and then he set off back to find the old woman. He went to the edge of the village and there was Gwyneth, waving, and he said, I got the heart I love the best. And off he went. And he went out of the valley, over the hill, down the hill, into the forest, knocked on the door. The door opened. Opened as if by an unseen hand. And there was the old woman. And she said, now the advantage of old people speaking in rhyme is that you can get everybody joining in. Okay? So she's going to speak, and then could you repeat what she says, please? Okay? So she says, a pot of brains you ask of me.
A pot of brains you ask of me.
There's no laughing in that bit. She says, but could you use them, we shall see.
But could you use them, we shall see.
Have you brought the heart you love the best?
Have you brought the heart you love the best?
Riddle me this, take my test.
Riddle me this, take my test.
And Morgan said, I thought this was the test. And she said, what runs but has no legs? And Morgan scratched his head. Morgan scratched his chin. He scratched his nose and then he wiped his nose. And yeah, it's my nose. My nose runs and it hasn't got any legs. And the old woman smiled at him and said, wrong! This is not the heart you love the best. You will have no brains from me. And so Morgan left with nothing. And he went back over the hill, down into the valley, past Gwyneth, who looked at him. And he went back home. When he arrived home, there was a strange silence. He opened the door and called out his mother's name, but there was no answer. Instead, there were 3 of his mother's old friends wrapped in their black shawls like crows, reading the Bible. And there was the minister, who looked up at him and shook his head. Morgan ran to his mother's room, and there she was, laid out on the bed. No warning, gone. And Morgan knelt down by the bed and cried out to God at the injustice of it, and he wept, and he called out to God for his mother to be returned, for he loved her so much. She had such a good heart. She was the best. He went back into the parlour and shooed out the old women and the minister, and he went to the kitchen and got the biggest knife. And he went into his mother's bedroom and... What's wrong, Richard? Where do you think the story is going? He cut up a sheet and made a winding cloth for the body. Okay? Right. Gee. What do you know? This is Wales we're talking about here. So, then he went to bed, and in the morning he woke up and he had to make himself breakfast. Of course, he'd never had to do anything for himself. And so he fried eggs. Well, he tried to fry eggs. More of the white ended up on the floor and the yolk ended up down his shirt. But he had some sort of breakfast. And then he picked up his mother's body in the winding sheet, over his shoulder, and walked out of the village. And as he crossed the threshold, there was Gwyneth, and he said, I've got the heart I love the best. I'm taking my mother to the old woman. And Gwyneth said, I thought your mother was... Oh. Good luck. And so off Morgan went up the hill into the forest. Door Door opens as if by an...
Unseen
Okay, yeah. And the old woman said, "A pot of brains you ask of me,
A pot of brains you ask of me,
but could you use them, we shall see.
but could you use them, we shall see.
Is this the heart you love the best?
Is this the heart you love the best?
Riddle me this, take my test."
Riddle me this, take my test.
And Morgan was ready and she said, "What is golden and shines but is not gold?" And Morgan scratched his head. Oh, Morgan scratched his chin. Morgan scratched his nose. Morgan scratched his chin. Oh, the yolk was all down. "The yolk of an egg," he said. The old woman smiled at him. "Wrong! You get no brains from me. That's not the heart you love the best." And so he had to trudge back to the village with his mother over his shoulder. And as he walked past Gwyneth, she looked at him and he said, No, it's not the heart I love the best." And Gwyneth said, "Oh, Morgan, what will you do? You need someone to look after you." And he said, "Would you look after me like my mother?" And she said, "Well, not quite like your mother." He said, "Would you do the cooking?" And she said, "The cooking would be done." He said, "Would you do the cleaning?" She said, "The cleaning would be done." He said, "Would you do the sewing?" She said, "The sewing would be done." So they agreed. And they went to the minister and they got married, stopping off at the undertaker on the way to the minister. And then they went back to the cottage, to their home, and they went to bed, and Morgan learnt that Gwyneth did not look after him like his mother. In the morning, he woke up in Gwyneth's arms, and he lay there and he said, "I love you the best, and I can lie here hearing your heart." And Gwyneth said, "You need the heart you love the best. Shall I go and get the kitchen knife so you can cut out my heart?" And Morgan was horrified. She said, "Or I could come with you and you could present my still beating heart in my body." So they went hand in hand through the village, out of the village, over the hill, into the forest, to the cottage. Door opened as if... And the old woman said, "A pot of brains you ask of me,
A pot of brains you ask of me,
but could you use them, we shall see.
but could you use them, we shall see.
Is this the heart you love the best?
Is this the heart you love the best?
Riddle me this, take my test."
Riddle me this, take my test.
And Morgan said, I can't do any more riddles. I don't know the answers to the first two riddles. I don't know what runs and hasn't got legs." And Gwyneth said, "Water." "It's water," said Morgan. And the old woman looked at Gwyneth and smiled. And he said, "But I don't know what's shiny and golden, but isn't gold." And Gwyneth said, "The sun." And Morgan said, "Perhaps it's the sun." And the old woman smiled at Gwyneth. And then she said, "But now riddle me this and take my test. What is as ancient as the world but is only 1 month old?" Come on. What's as ancient as the world?
Oh, the moon.
Well done.
It's up there.
You can be Gwyneth for tonight. Gwyneth said, "The moon." And Morgan said, "The moon! The moon!" He said, "Now, can I have my pot of brains?" And the old woman said, "You already have them." He said, "Where? Don't feel any different." And she said, "There they are, between your wife's ears." And so Gwyneth and Morgan returned to their home very happy, with enough brains to share between the two of them. And I am sure that the sewing, the washing and the cleaning got done, but by whom, I will leave you to decide for yourself. And that is the story of the pot of brains, and that is how you and I have told it.